The morning sun streamed through the windows of Flight 2317, casting long shadows across the pristine cabin of the Skyline Airways aircraft. It was just another Tuesday morning flight from Atlanta to San Francisco, or so everyone thought. Among the passengers settling into their first-class seats was a woman dressed in a simple yet elegant navy blazer and black slacks, her natural hair styled in a professional updo. She chose to remain low-key, something she had mastered over the years despite being one of the most influential figures in the aviation industry. Mrs. Richardson had worked her way up from humble beginnings, starting as a baggage handler 2 decades ago, to now owning a controlling stake in Skyline Airways. Yet today, she decided to fly as any other passenger would, taking notes on her airline service quality firsthand, a practice she believed essential for maintaining excellence. The flight attendant working the first-class cabin that morning was having a particularly challenging day. Her young son had been sick, resulting in barely 3 hours of sleep, and she was covering for a colleague who had called in at the last minute. Despite her exhaustion, she maintained a professional demeanor, though her movements were slightly less coordinated than usual. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the service began. The flight attendant moved methodically through the cabin, serving premium coffee in fine china cups, a Skyline Airways signature touch that Mrs. Richardson had personally implemented years ago. The atmosphere was peaceful, filled with the gentle hum of the engines and quiet conversations. Then it happened. As the flight attendant approached Mrs. Richardson's seat, another passenger suddenly reclined their seat without warning. The unexpected movement caused the flight attendant to stumble slightly, and in that split second, the hot coffee tilted precariously on her serving tray. Time seemed to slow down as the dark liquid arced through the air, landing squarely on Mrs. Richardson's lap and splashing onto her crisp white blouse beneath her blazer. The cabin fell silent. The flight attendant's face drained of color as she frantically reached for napkins, apologizing profusely. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. Please, let me help you clean this up." Her hands trembled as she tried to damage control the situation, fully aware that such incidents could cost her her job, a job she desperately needed as a single mother. Mrs. Richardson sat perfectly still, coffee dripping from her clothes onto the premium leather seat. The other first-class passengers watched the scene unfold, some already pulling out their phones, anticipating drama. They had seen similar incidents before, entitled passengers berating airline staff over minor accidents. Some were already whispering, expecting an explosive confrontation. What happened next would soon become a story that would spread throughout the entire airline industry, challenging preconceptions and reminding everyone about the power of compassion in the corporate world. But at that moment, as coffee continued to seep into the expensive fabric of her clothing, Mrs. Richardson simply looked at the distressed flight attendant, her expression unreadable. The tension in the cabin was palpable as everyone waited to see how this apparently ordinary passenger would react to having scalding coffee spilled on her designer outfit. Little did they know, this incident would spark a chain of events that would not only change the flight attendant's life but would also set a new standard for leadership in the aviation industry. As Mrs. Richardson finally moved to respond, the flight attendant braced herself for what she assumed would be a severe reprimand. However, the words that would come next would leave everyone on that flight speechless, proving that sometimes the most powerful moments of leadership happen when nobody knows you're the boss. Instead of the expected outburst, Mrs. Richardson slowly reached for a napkin and dabbed at her coffee-stained clothes. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was surprisingly gentle. "Are you all right?" she asked the flight attendant, who stood frozen in shock at this unexpected response. The flight attendant blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. I'm fine, ma'am, but your clothes. I'm terribly sorry about this. I can call ahead to have our ground team arrange for cleaning services at your arrival." Mrs. Richardson noticed the slight tremble in the flight attendant's hands, the dark circles under her eyes partially hidden by makeup, and the way she kept glancing anxiously at her watch. 20 years in the airline industry had taught her to read people well, and she could see a struggling mother trying her best to maintain professionalism despite personal challenges. "What's troubling you?" Mrs. Richardson asked quietly, ensuring other passengers couldn't hear. "You seem to be carrying quite a burden today." The flight attendant's professional facade cracked slightly. She hadn't expected compassion from a first-class passenger, especially not after such a mistake. It's been a difficult morning," she admitted softly. "My 5-year-old has been sick, and I'm covering an extra shift because we're short-staffed, and..." She caught herself, remembering her training. "But that's no excuse for my carelessness, ma'am. I understand if you want to file a complaint. I can get the proper forms." Mrs. Richardson raised her hand gently to stop her. "Please, sit down for a moment," she said, patting the empty seat beside her. The other passengers watched in bewilderment as the coffee-soaked woman engaged in quiet conversation with the flight attendant who had just ruined her expensive outfit. "How long have you been with Skyline Airways?" Mrs. Richardson inquired, her voice warm and interested. 3 years next month," the flight attendant replied, still nervous but gradually relaxing. "It's been a blessing, really. The medical benefits have been crucial for my son, and the flexible scheduling usually helps with childcare, except for days like today." As they talked, Mrs. Richardson made mental notes about the airline staff support systems and scheduling protocols. Each word from the flight attendant provided valuable insights into the real challenges faced by her frontline employees, perspectives she couldn't get from corporate reports and board meetings. The conversation was interrupted by turbulence, reminding the flight attendant of her duties. As she stood to resume her service, Mrs. Richardson reached into her handbag and pulled out a business card, holding it face down. "I'd like you to have this," she said, "but please, wait until after the flight to look at it." The flight attendant accepted the card hesitantly, tucking it into her uniform pocket. She had no way of knowing that this simple piece of paper would change the trajectory of her career, or that this seemingly ordinary passenger would become not just her advocate but a mentor who would reshape corporate policies across the entire airline. As the flight attendant moved away to attend to other passengers, whispers circulated through the cabin. The other first-class passengers, who had expected drama and confrontation, were left to ponder this unusual display of grace and empathy. But the real story was just beginning to unfold, and the next few hours would prove that sometimes the most powerful leadership lessons come from unexpected moments of crisis. As the flight continued toward San Francisco, the flight attendant found herself stealing glances at the mysterious passenger in seat 3A. There was something different about Mrs. Richardson, a quiet dignity that went beyond the typical first-class passenger demeanor. Despite her coffee-stained clothes, she worked calmly on her laptop, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound notebook with the Skyline Airways logo embossed on its cover. The business card in the flight attendant's pocket felt like it was burning a hole through her uniform. Her curiosity was overwhelming, but she respected the passenger's request to wait until after the flight. Instead, she focused on providing impeccable service to the remaining passengers, though her mind kept drifting back to the unusual interaction. Halfway through the flight, another incident occurred that would further reveal Mrs. Richardson's true character. An elderly passenger a few rows behind began experiencing breathing difficulties. As the flight attendant rushed to assist with the medical emergency, she noticed Mrs. Richardson quietly observing the situation, taking in every detail of how the crew handled the crisis. The flight attendant maintained her composure, efficiently following emergency protocols she had trained for countless times. She retrieved the medical kit, made the necessary announcements, and coordinated with a doctor who happened to be on board. Throughout the emergency, she could feel Mrs. Richardson's eyes on her, watching as she transformed from the nervous, apologetic figure of earlier into a confident professional managing a crisis. After the elderly passenger was stabilized, Mrs. Richardson made a few more notes in her notebook. The flight attendant caught a glimpse of the words, emergency response, and crew efficiency written in elegant handwriting, but thought nothing of it at the moment. She was too busy ensuring the affected passenger remained comfortable for the remainder of the flight. As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, the flight attendant started her final cabin checks. When she reached Mrs. Richardson's seat, she found the coffee stains had dried into dark patches on the expensive fabric. "Ma'am," she began hesitantly, "I've arranged for our ground team to provide you with cleaning service information upon landing." Mrs. Richardson looked up from her notebook with a warm smile. "You've handled yourself admirably today," she said softly. "Both with my situation and the medical emergency. It's not easy to maintain professionalism under pressure, especially when dealing with personal challenges." The flight attendant felt a lump in her throat. In 3 years of flying, she had never encountered a passenger who showed such understanding. "Thank you, ma'am," she managed to say. "Your kindness means more than you know." What she didn't realize was that Mrs. Richardson's kindness was more than just simple human empathy. It was the calculated observation of a leader who had spent years studying how to build a more compassionate corporate culture. As the plane touched down at San Francisco International Airport, neither woman knew that this flight would become a catalyst for significant changes in how Skyline Airways approached employee welfare and crisis management. The moment of truth approached as passengers began to deplane. The flight attendant's hand instinctively moved to her pocket, where the mysterious business card waited to reveal its secrets. But first, she had to complete her duties, unaware that her life was about to change dramatically in the next few minutes. As the last passengers filed out of the aircraft, the flight attendant finally had a moment to herself in the now quiet cabin. She reached into her pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out the business card. The moment she turned it over, her eyes widened, and she had to grab the nearest seat to steady herself. The card was made of heavy cream-colored stock, with the Skyline Airways logo embossed in silver. Below it, in elegant lettering, were the words, "Mrs. Richardson, Chief Executive Officer and Majority Owner, Skyline Airways." The flight attendant stared at the card, her mind racing back through every interaction during the flight. The coffee spill, the gentle questions, the notebook with the company logo, it all suddenly made sense. Just then, she heard footsteps returning to the cabin. Mrs. Richardson appeared in the doorway, now wearing a fresh blazer that had been brought to her by the ground crew. "I hope you don't mind that I came back," she said with a warm smile. "I wanted to make sure you had a chance to look at the card." The flight attendant immediately straightened up, her training kicking in despite her shock. "Ma'am, I had no idea. The coffee, your clothes. I can't believe I..." Mrs. Richardson raised her hand gently, just as she had done earlier. "What I saw today was exactly what I needed to see. A dedicated employee who, despite personal challenges, maintained professionalism and showed genuine care for passengers. Even more importantly, I saw someone who handled a crisis with grace." She stepped closer, her voice taking on a more businesslike tone. "I've been conducting unofficial flight audits for years. It's the best way to understand both our passengers' experience and our employees' challenges. Today's flight showed me something special." The flight attendant looked down at the ruined clothes that Mrs. Richardson had been wearing earlier, now draped over her arm. "But I spilled coffee on the CEO," she whispered, still mortified. Mrs. Richardson laughed softly. "You showed me something far more valuable than a clean outfit. You showed me humanity. The way you handled both the spill and the medical emergency demonstrated exactly the kind of person we need in our management team." The flight attendant's heart skipped a beat. "Management team?" "Yes," Mrs. Richardson nodded. "We're creating a new position in our flight operations department, focusing on crew welfare and emergency response training. After what I've seen today, I believe you'd be perfect for the role. The position would offer better hours for your situation with your son, and your experience on the front lines would be invaluable." Tears welled up in the flight attendant's eyes as the reality of this opportunity sank in. What had started as possibly the worst day of her career was transforming into something she couldn't have imagined. But Mrs. Richardson wasn't finished yet. Sitting down in the first-class cabin, Mrs. Richardson gestured for the flight attendant to join her. "There's something else you should know," she began, opening her leather notebook. "Those notes I was taking weren't just about today's flight. I've been developing a new company-wide initiative, and today's events have convinced me it's time to implement it." She turned the notebook, revealing pages of detailed observations and plans. "We're calling it the Human First program. It's designed to reshape how we support our employees, especially those juggling family responsibilities with their careers. Your situation today, having to work despite your son being sick, that's exactly what we need to address." The flight attendant listened intently as Mrs. Richardson outlined her vision. The program would include emergency childcare support, improved healthcare benefits, and more flexible scheduling options. "But what we really need," Mrs. Richardson continued, "is someone who understands these challenges firsthand to help shape and implement these policies." "You want me to?" the flight attendant began, barely daring to believe what she was hearing. "To be part of the development team, yes. Your experience today, both the struggles and how you handled them, makes you uniquely qualified to help us create meaningful change." Mrs. Richardson's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "Sometimes the best insights come from our most challenging moments." As they discussed the details, the ground crew respectfully kept their distance, though they couldn't help but wonder why the CEO was having such an intense conversation with a flight attendant. Word had already begun to spread through the airport about how the owner of Skyline Airways had been doused with coffee yet responded with unprecedented grace. The flight attendant found herself sharing ideas she'd had for years but never thought she could voice, about crew scheduling, about support systems for working parents, about improving emergency response protocols. Mrs. Richardson listened intently, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. "You see," Mrs. Richardson explained, "I started as a baggage handler myself. I learned that the best ways to improve a company often come from those working on the front lines. Today's incident reminded me why I've always believed in leading with empathy." She paused, looking thoughtfully at her coffee-stained clothes. "Sometimes it takes an accident to reveal an opportunity. Had you not spilled that coffee, I might never have seen the potential in you that's so evident now. Life has a strange way of creating perfect moments from imperfect situations." The flight attendant felt her perspective shifting. What had started as a dreaded mistake was transforming into a pivotal moment not just for her career, but potentially for thousands of other employees. As they continued their discussion, neither woman noticed the setting sun casting long shadows through the aircraft windows, too engrossed in their shared vision for the future. The story of what happened on Flight 2317 spread through Skyline Airways like wildfire. Within days, employees at every level were talking about how their CEO had turned a coffee accident into a catalyst for change. But what happened next would prove even more remarkable than the initial incident. 2 weeks after the flight, Mrs. Richardson called a company-wide meeting. The grand conference room at Skyline's headquarters was packed with executives, managers, and representatives from every department. The flight attendant, now dressed in a professional suit rather than her usual uniform, sat nervously in the front row. Mrs. Richardson stood at the podium, her presence commanding yet approachable. 2 weeks ago, she began, I experienced something that reminded me of an important truth. Our company isn't built on aircraft or routes or profit margins. It's built on people, people who face real challenges while giving their best to this airline every day. She gestured to the flight attendant to join her at the podium. The room fell silent as Mrs. Richardson recounted the story of Flight 2317. But instead of focusing on the coffee spill, she highlighted the flight attendant's professionalism, her handling of the medical emergency, and her dedication despite personal challenges. Today, Mrs. Richardson announced, we're not just introducing a new program. We're introducing a new way of thinking about our corporate culture. She unveiled the details of the Human First initiative, explaining how it would transform employee support systems across the company. The flight attendant, standing beside her, watched in amazement as Mrs. Richardson credited her with helping shape key aspects of the program. Sometimes, Mrs. Richardson said, our greatest insights come from our most challenging moments. This initiative was born from a simple cup of coffee, but its impact will touch thousands of lives. The presentation included concrete changes: emergency childcare centers at major hubs, improved healthcare coverage, more flexible scheduling options, and a new employee welfare department, which the flight attendant would help lead. But perhaps most surprisingly, Mrs. Richardson announced that every executive would be required to work in the field for 2 days each quarter. If we want to understand our employees' needs, she explained, we need to walk in their shoes. Whether that means loading baggage, serving drinks, or working at the check-in counter, our leadership team needs to experience the real challenges our staff faces. The room erupted in applause. Veteran employees whispered that they'd never seen anything like it in their careers. But for the flight attendant, the most powerful moment came after the presentation, when Mrs. Richardson turned to her and said, "Remember how you felt that day when you thought you'd made a career-ending mistake? Your story is going to help ensure that other employees never have to feel that fear again." 6 months after the coffee incident, Skyline Airways had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The flight attendant, now Director of Employee Welfare and Emergency Response Training, sat in her new office overlooking the airport runway. On her desk stood a framed coffee cup, a gift from Mrs. Richardson that served as a reminder of how unexpected moments can change lives. The changes weren't just on paper. The first employee childcare center had opened at the Atlanta hub, providing round-the-clock care for staff members' children. Already, it had helped dozens of crew members manage their challenging schedules. The flight attendant's own son was thriving there, especially on days when she had early meetings or late flights to supervise. But the most visible change was in the company's culture. The sight of executives working alongside ground crew, flight attendants, and gate agents had become common. Just last week, the CFO had spent a day loading baggage, gaining first-hand experience of the physical demands faced by ground staff. These experiences were already leading to practical improvements in working conditions and equipment. The flight attendant's phone buzzed with a message. It was a photo from a crew member in Chicago. Their young child was sleeping peacefully in the new childcare center while they covered an emergency shift. "Thank you for making this possible," the message read. She smiled, remembering her own struggles just months ago. During a leadership meeting that afternoon, Mrs. Richardson shared some remarkable statistics. Employee satisfaction scores had risen by 40%, turnover had decreased significantly, and surprisingly, customer satisfaction ratings had reached all-time highs. "When we take care of our people," she said, "they take better care of our passengers." But the most touching moment came when the flight attendant presented her latest initiative, a comprehensive emergency response training program that incorporated real experiences from crew members. "We're not just teaching procedures," she explained to the board. "We're teaching empathy, understanding, and how to turn challenging situations into opportunities for connection." As she concluded her presentation, Mrs. Richardson stood up. 6 months ago, a cup of coffee could have been just a ruined outfit and a disciplinary action. Instead, it became the catalyst for transforming our entire company. She turned to the flight attendant. "Your story has become part of our corporate DNA, a reminder that how we handle our mistakes matters more than the mistakes themselves." After the meeting, walking through the terminal, the flight attendant passed a new display in the employee area. It showcased the company's core values, and at the center was a quote, "Leadership isn't about avoiding spills, it's about how we help each other clean them up." Below it was a simple coffee cup icon, now the unofficial symbol of the company's commitment to compassionate leadership. 1 year to the day after the famous coffee incident, Skyline Airways hosted its annual leadership conference. The grand ballroom was filled with industry leaders, employees, and media representatives, all eager to learn about the company's remarkable transformation. But this year's conference was different. It wasn't being held in a luxury hotel or corporate venue, but in the newly constructed Employee Development Center, right next to the childcare facility. Mrs. Richardson had insisted on this location, wanting everyone to see firsthand how the company had revolutionized employee support. The former flight attendant, now a respected senior executive, stood at the podium, preparing to deliver the keynote speech. Looking out at the audience, she saw dozens of familiar faces, crew members whose lives had been touched by the changes of the past year. 1 year ago, she began, I thought I had ruined my career by spilling coffee on a passenger. That passenger turned out to be our CEO, and that spill turned out to be the best mistake I ever made. Gentle laughter rippled through the audience. But the real story isn't about coffee, or even about me. It's about what happens when leadership chooses to see people first. She gestured to the screens behind her, which displayed images of the company's transformations, the childcare centers now operating at 5 major hubs, executives working alongside ground crews, improved break rooms and rest areas, and most importantly, the smiling faces of employees who no longer had to choose between their families and their careers. Our company's value increased by 30% this year, she continued, but our true success can't be measured in dollars. It's measured in the parents who can now attend their children's school events, in the crew members who no longer fear making honest mistakes, and in the culture of compassion that has become our hallmark. Mrs. Richardson joined her on stage, carrying what appeared to be the same coffee-stained outfit from that fateful day. We kept this as a reminder, Mrs. Richardson explained to the audience, not of a mistake, but of a moment when we realized that our greatest opportunities often come disguised as accidents. Together, they unveiled Skyline's newest initiative, a leadership academy focused on compassionate management, open to employees at all levels. The program would include hands-on experience in various roles, ensuring that future leaders would understand their company from every angle. As the presentation concluded, Mrs. Richardson made one final announcement. Today, we're not just celebrating a year of change. We're celebrating a new understanding of what corporate leadership can be. And to make it official, we're renaming our corporate headquarters. The curtain fell from the building's facade, revealing its new name, the Richardson Walker Center for Compassionate Leadership, finally revealing the flight attendant's last name and acknowledging her role in transforming the company. The story of the coffee incident had come full circle, but its impact continued to ripple outward. Other airlines began adopting similar programs, and business schools started teaching the Skyline coffee case as an example of transformative leadership. What began as a simple accident had evolved into a movement, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes start with a simple moment of human understanding. As the ceremony ended and the applause faded, Mrs. Richardson and Mrs. Walker shared a knowing look. The coffee stains had long since faded from that outfit, but the lessons they inspired had become permanently woven into the fabric of corporate culture, reminding everyone that true leadership is less about avoiding spills and more about how we help each other grow from them.